Early 1944, the sky over Germany, deep inside the Reich, far from any coast, in the place where German fighter pilots had always been safest. If you were a German fighter pilot, you had built your entire professional life around a single, reliable, comforting fact of geometry. And the fact was this: the enemy's bombers could reach you, but the enemy's fighters could not. You knew the numbers by heart because your life depended on them. A fighter aircraft carries a limited amount of fuel, and fuel determines range, and range is a hard physical limit that no amount of courage or skill can extend. The American and British bombers, big aircraft with big fuel tanks, could fly deep into Germany. But the fighters that escorted them, the small, thirsty, short-legged fighters, could only come so far. They would turn back at the German border, or a little beyond it, because if they came further, they would not have the fuel to get home. And past that turnback point, the bombers flew on alone. And that turnback point was where you did your work. You waited until the escorts had turned for home, and then you fell upon the unescorted bombers, and you tore them apart, because a bomber without fighter protection was, as we saw in an earlier audit, a target rather than an enemy. The whole German air defense strategy against the American day bombing campaign rested on this geometry. Let the escorts leave. Hit the bombers when they are alone. It had worked, catastrophically well, through the terrible battles of 1943, when unescorted American formations deep over Germany had suffered losses so severe that the whole daylight bombing campaign had nearly collapsed. So you knew, with the certainty of physics, that deep over Germany you would face bombers, but never fighters. The fighters could not reach that far. It was not a matter of enemy intention. It was a matter of fuel, and fuel was a law of nature. And then, in the early months of 1944, you looked up over Berlin. Over Berlin, the deepest heart of Germany, further from the coast than almost anywhere, and there were American fighters. Not bombers. Fighters. Escort fighters, deep over the capital, hundreds of miles beyond where any fighter had any right to be, flying with an ease that said they had plenty of fuel left, ready and waiting for you exactly where you had always been safe. The conclusion available to a German pilot was, at first, simple disbelief. It was impossible. Fighters could not fly that far. There must be some mistake, a new type, a special long-range variant fielded in tiny numbers, an aberration. It could not be a general fact, because a general fact meant that the one reliable comfort of your professional life, the safety of the deep sky, was gone, and the bombers you had been feasting on would now come with teeth all the way to the target and all the way home. It was a general fact, and the thing that made it possible was not some miracle of aeronautical engineering, not a revolutionary new engine or a breakthrough airframe. It was, in large part, something almost insultingly simple, a cheap, crude, throwaway object that solved the range problem not with brilliance, but with a kind of blunt practicality that was itself the most American thing imaginable. This is not a story about fighters. This is a forensic audit of how the Americans solved the one problem that was supposed to be unsolvable, the range of a fighter, and of how the solution, and the failure that preceded it, reveal the same pattern we have found in every episode. An enemy who thought a limit was a law of nature, and an American system that treated it as a problem to be engineered away. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to begin, as always, by taking the German position seriously, because the German understanding of fighter range was not wrong. It was correct. It was simply incomplete, in a way that proved fatal. The German fighter force was built around the interceptor, the defensive fighter whose job was to rise from bases in Germany and the occupied territories, climb to the bombers, and destroy them. And for that job, range was not a priority. An interceptor does not need to fly far. It needs to climb fast, fly fast, and hit hard over its own territory, close to its own bases. The German fighters were superb interceptors, fast, well-armed, deadly in the climb, and the slashing attack. They were optimized, correctly, for the battle they expected to fight, a defensive battle over their own ground. And in that role, the short range of a fighter was not a flaw. It was simply irrelevant. Why would a defensive interceptor need to fly hundreds of miles? it was fighting over home. The enemy came to it. So the German fighter was, by design, short-legged, and this was a rational choice for its intended role. The Germans, like everyone, understood that fighters had limited range, and they understood it as a universal constraint, a law that applied to all fighters, theirs and the enemy's alike. And from that universal law, they drew the strategic conclusion that shaped their entire air defense doctrine. The enemy's escort fighters, being fighters, would also be short-legged and would therefore have to turn back long before the bombers reached their deep targets, leaving the bombers exposed. This was not stupidity. It was sound reasoning from a true premise. Fighters did have limited range. Escort fighters did, in 1943, turn back at the German frontier. The bombers were exposed deep over Germany, and the Germans exploited that exposure with devastating effect. Everything the Germans believed about escort range was, at the time they believed it, true. The error was not in the premise. The error was in assuming the premise was permanent, that because fighters had always had limited range, they always would, that the turn-back point was fixed by physics rather than by an engineering choice that could be revisited. The Germans treated a solvable problem as an unsolvable law and built their entire strategy on the assumption that the enemy would never solve it. And underneath this lay a deeper German constraint, the one that runs through every episode. Even if the Germans had wanted to build a genuine long-range escort fighter, they could not have sustained it, because the thing that makes a fighter fly far is fuel, and fuel was the one thing Germany never had. A long-range fighter burns enormous quantities of fuel. That is what long-range means. For a fuel-starved Air Force that was increasingly unable even to train its pilots for lack of aviation fuel, the idea of fielding fleets of thirsty long-range fighters was a fantasy. German fighter doctrine was short-range partly by design and partly because Germany could not have afforded to fuel anything else. That is the German calculus. A fighter force correctly optimized as a short-range defensive interceptor, resting on the true but temporary premise that escort fighters could not reach deep targets, building an entire air defense strategy on the assumption that this limit was permanent, and unable, in any case, to build long-range fighters of its own, because long-range means fuel, and fuel was the German famine that never ended. Now let us look at the crude, cheap, throwaway thing that broke the geometry. Part 2. The American answer. The American solution to the fighter range problem came in two parts, and the interesting thing is that the first part was a catastrophic failure, and the second part was one of the most decisive fixes of the entire air war. And the sequence, failure, then fix, is the most American thing about the whole story. Start with the failure, because we touched on it in the bomber audit, and it is the necessary background. In 1943, the American day bombing campaign was built on a theory that the self-defending bomber formation could fight its way to deep targets without escort. That theory failed bloodily over Germany in the second half of 1943, when unescorted formations penetrating deep into the Reich suffered losses so catastrophic that the deep raids had to be suspended. The Americans had run headlong into exactly the German geometry. Bombers deep over Germany, escorts long since turned back, German fighters feasting on the undefended formations. So the Americans had a problem, and they had it in the worst possible way. Proven in blood, undeniable, threatening the collapse of the entire daylight bombing effort. The escort fighters could not reach the deep targets. The bombers could not survive without them. Something had to change, or the campaign was finished. And it is worth pausing on what proven in blood actually meant, because the numbers are staggering, and they are the reason the drop tank matters so much. On the worst of the deep raids into Germany in the autumn of 1943, American bomber formations lost a fifth or more of their aircraft in a single mission. Dozens of four-engine bombers shot down in an afternoon, each carrying 10 men. Hundreds of trained crewmen lost or captured in the space of a few hours. A loss rate like that is not sustainable for more than a handful of missions before the entire force is gone. The Germans, attacking those undefended formations deep over their own territory, were winning the daylight battle outright, and they were winning it precisely in the deep sky that no escort could reach. That was the crisis. Every trained bomber crewman was, as we saw, an enormous investment that took many months to replace, and they were being lost in job lots on the deep raids, faster than they could ever be made. The Daylight Campaign was, in the last months of 1943, on the edge of total defeat, and the single technical reason was the turn-back point of the escort fighters. Solve the escort range, and the whole equation inverted. That is how much rested on a cheap tin fuel tank. And here the American answer came, and it came in that characteristic American style. Not one silver bullet, but a combination of things, some of them clever, and some of them almost stupidly simple, all of them mass-produced and thrown at the problem until it broke. The simple thing first, because it is the heart of our story, the drop tank. A drop tank is exactly what it sounds like. It is an external fuel tank, hung under the fighter's wings or belly, carrying extra fuel, and designed to be dropped, jettisoned, thrown away, the moment it was empty or the moment combat began. That is the whole idea. Carry extra fuel in a cheap external tank, burn that fuel first on the long flight out, and then drop the empty tank and fight, as a clean, agile fighter with your internal fuel intact for the combat and the flight home. It sounds almost too simple to matter, and that is precisely why it is such a perfect example of the American way. The drop tank was not a feat of advanced engineering. It was a cheap, crude, expendable container for fuel, mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands, thrown away by the sky full over Germany. And it multiplied the range of the escort fighters enormously, because most of the long flight to the target could be flown on the fuel in the disposable tanks, leaving the internal fuel, the fuel that determined combat radius and the flight home, untouched until it was needed. The Germans, incidentally, understood drop tanks perfectly well and used them too. The drop tank was not an American invention, but the Americans applied it to the specific problem of long-range escort with a thoroughness and a scale, and married it to the right aircraft in a way that transformed it from a useful accessory into a war-winning capability. Because the second part of the American answer was the aircraft, and above all one aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was the thing the Germans thought could not exist, a fighter that was, at once, an excellent dogfighter, the equal or superior of the German fighters in combat, and possessed of genuinely long range. It combined an aerodynamically efficient airframe, a superb engine, large internal fuel capacity, and the ability to carry drop tanks into a single aircraft that could escort the bombers all the way to the deepest targets in Germany, fight the German interceptors on equal or better terms when it got there, and fly home. It dissolved the trade-off that everyone had assumed was iron, the trade-off between range and fighting quality. The Mustang did not sacrifice combat performance for range. It had both. And the combination, the long-range Mustang, plus drop tanks, plus the other escort fighters extended by the same methods, produced in enormous numbers, broke the German geometry completely. Suddenly the escorts did not turn back at the frontier. They went all the way. The bombers were protected all the way to the target and all the way home. And the German fighters, which had built their entire strategy on attacking undefended bombers deep over Germany, now found those bombers escorted by superb fighters everywhere they went. The turn-back point, the fixed geometric fact on which the entire German air defense rested, simply moved and kept moving until it was gone, until there was nowhere over Germany deep enough to be safe from American fighters. Part 3. The River of Steel. The defeat of the German fighter force in the first half of 1944 is one of the decisive events of the war, and it is worth being clear about how it happened, because it was not only that the escorts now protected the bombers. It was something more aggressive and more final than that. Once the escort fighters could range deep over Germany, the Americans changed their mission. The escorts were no longer tied closely to the bombers, flying defensively alongside them. They were released to hunt, to range ahead and around the bomber streams, to seek out the German fighters and destroy them, to attack them as they climbed to intercept, to chase them down to their airfields and strafe them on the ground. The long-range fighter, and above all the Mustang, became not just a shield, but a weapon of annihilation, aimed directly at the German fighter force. And the effect was catastrophic for the Germans, because it attacked the one thing they could least afford to lose, their experienced pilots. We saw in the bomber audit how the German fighter arm had no pilot rotation, no end of tour, and flew its men until they died. Now the long-range escorts accelerated that death enormously. The German fighters were forced to come up and fight. They had to get at the bombers. And when they came up, they met not undefended bombers, but swarms of superb long-range fighters, actively hunting them. German fighter losses soared. The experienced pilots, already being ground away, were now consumed at a catastrophic rate, and the training system, starved of fuel, could not replace them with anything but half-trained boys who died even faster. This is the deeper meaning of the long-range fighter, and it connects directly to the theme of the whole air war. The bombing campaign's greatest strategic achievement was arguably not the bombs it dropped, but the fighter battle it forced, the way it compelled the German fighter force to come up and be destroyed by the escorts. And that destruction was only possible because the escorts could now go where the German fighters were, deep over Germany, all the way to Berlin and beyond. The drop tank and the Mustang did not just protect the bombers. They carried the killing of the German fighter force into the deepest German sky, and they won air superiority over Germany itself in the months before the invasion of France. Air superiority without which the invasion could not have succeeded. And behind it all, as always, was production and fuel. The Americans could field enormous numbers of long-range fighters, could equip them with drop tanks thrown away by the hundreds of thousands, and could fuel them all lavishly, because American aircraft production and American fuel were effectively without limit compared to the German famine. The Germans could not match the numbers, could not match the fuel, and could not, in the end, keep enough experienced pilots alive to contest the sky. The long-range escort fighter was the cutting edge, but behind the edge was the same bottomless industrial and fuel abundance that stood behind every American advantage in this series. The drop tank is the perfect small emblem of it. A cheap tin container of fuel, mass-produced and thrown away by the skyful, that solved a problem the Germans had believed was a law of nature, solved it not with genius, but with cheap fuel, cheap tanks, and the industrial willingness to throw away hundreds of thousands of them over Germany. The Germans counted every liter of fuel. The Americans hung extra fuel under their fighters in disposable tanks and dropped them empty over enemy territory without a second thought. That contrast is the whole war. Part 4. The German realization. The German realization about the long-range fighter was sudden, shocking, and correctly understood at the highest levels as a catastrophe, and the German leadership's reaction is one of the most telling things in the air war. When American fighters appeared over Berlin in early 1944, the most senior German air commanders understood immediately what it meant. There is a famous remark attributed to the head of the German fighter force, to the effect that when he saw American fighters over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Whether or not the words are exact, the sentiment was precisely correct, and it was widely felt among the German air leadership. The appearance of escort fighters over the capital meant that the fundamental geometry of the air defense had collapsed, that the bombers could no longer be caught undefended, and that the German fighter force would now be forced into a battle of attrition against superb long-range fighters, a battle it could not win, because it could not replace its losses. They understood, in other words, that a limit they had believed permanent had been engineered away, and that the entire strategic edifice built on that limit had collapsed in consequence. And the German response revealed, one final time, the depth of their predicament. They could not counter the long-range fighter, for all the interlocking reasons this channel has documented. They could not field their own long-range fighters in numbers, because they had no fuel. They could not replace their pilot losses, because they had no fuel to train new ones, and no rotation to preserve the veterans. They could not outproduce the American fighter fleets. They tried technological answers, faster aircraft, jet fighters, new weapons, and some of these were remarkable, but they came too late, and in numbers too small, fielded by a pilot corps being annihilated and an industry being bombed, and they could not reverse a defeat that was, by then, already decided in the deep sky over Germany. And the deepest German realization was the familiar one, in a new and final form. They had been beaten not by a superior idea they could not comprehend. They understood drop tanks and long-range fighters perfectly well, but by an enemy who could take a simple, well-understood solution and apply it at a scale, with a fuel abundance and married to an aircraft that Germany could not match. The Mustang was a superb aircraft, and the Germans respected it, but it was not magic. What made it decisive was that America could build it in enormous numbers, fuel it without limit, hang throwaway tanks under it by the hundreds of thousands, and fly it by masses of well-trained pilots into the deep German sky. And Germany could do none of those things. The German pilot who looked up over Berlin and saw American fighters where no fighter should have been was looking at the end of the one geometric certainty his professional life had rested on. And behind that certainty's collapse was not a miracle, but a cheap tin fuel tank, a superb mass-produced aircraft, and an ocean of fuel. The same three things, in the end, that the Germans lacked in everything: cheap mass production, the right design, and the fuel to run it all without counting. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle flew escort fighters in that war, the long, cold, dangerous hours over Germany, protecting the bombers and hunting the enemy fighters, or if he worked on them, fueled them, armed them, or built the drop tanks and the aircraft that made it possible, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. The fighter pilots who won air superiority over Germany did some of the most dangerous work of the war, and the long-range Escort was one of its decisive weapons. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1944. Spring. American fighters own the sky over Germany. The German fighter force is being destroyed in the air it was supposed to rule, and the road to the invasion of France, and to victory, runs through the air superiority that the long-range escort fighter won. So here is the verdict. The German fighter force was superbly designed for the battle it expected to fight, a short-range defensive battle over its own territory, and it built a sound and deadly strategy on the true premise that escort fighters could not reach deep targets. And it was destroyed because that premise, true when they adopted it, was not permanent, and the enemy engineered it away. The Americans took a limit that everyone, including themselves, had treated as fixed, the range of a fighter, and they refused to accept it as permanent. They had first to fail, bloodily, by ignoring the problem in the disastrous unescorted raids of 1943. And then they did what they always did. They identified the failure, and they crushed it, not with a single miracle, but with a combination of the clever and the crude, the superb Mustang and the almost absurdly simple throwaway drop tank, mass-produced, lavishly fueled, and flown in overwhelming numbers into the deepest German sky. The German pilot who thought the deep sky was safe was making the same error his whole army made about everything American. He mistook a temporary limit for a permanent law. He assumed the enemy could not solve a problem that the enemy simply went ahead and solved, not with genius he could not have imagined, but with cheap fuel, cheap tanks, and a superb aircraft built in numbers he could not match. The Germans built the perfect fighter for a battle over Germany. The Americans built a fighter that could follow them home, and then wait for them there, over their own capital, in the one place they had always been safe. The Germans counted every liter of fuel and flew their pilots until they died. The Americans hung throwaway tanks of fuel under their fighters, dropped them empty over Berlin, and flew all the way to the enemy's heart and back, because they had the fuel to spare, the aircraft to build, and the pilots to fly them, and the enemy, for all his brilliance, had none of the three. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these, more systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the simple solution. Nobody makes a film about a drop tank, a cheap tin container of fuel, stamped out by the hundreds of thousands, hung under a fighter's wing and thrown away empty over Germany, littering the fields of the Reich with discarded fuel tanks. It was not glamorous. It was not clever, particularly. It was one of the humblest objects of the entire air war. and it broke the back of the German fighter force, because it solved the one problem everyone had agreed could not be solved, and it solved it not with brilliance, but with the willingness to throw away cheap fuel tanks by the skyful, which only a nation swimming in fuel and industry could afford to do. The German pilot feared the Mustang, and he was right too. But behind the Mustang, making it possible to be over Berlin at all, was that humble throwaway tank. The small, cheap, expendable thing that a rich nation could scatter across the enemy's sky without a thought, and that a poor one could only watch fall. Mostly, when an American fighter needed to reach Berlin, the fuel was there to carry it. In a tank it would drop, empty, and never think about again. They deserve to be remembered. The pilots, the ground crews, and the workers who stamped out those humble tanks by the hundreds of thousands. By the plain truth that sometimes the thing that wins a war is not a miracle of engineering, but a cheap and simple solution, mass-produced and thrown away without counting, by a nation rich enough to solve a law of nature with a tin can full of fuel.